Hello, my name is Krista. I'm part of group EST2. This is our behavior change replication project. On this recording, we have Caitlin, Mila, Delaney, Pam, and Kat. This is our behavior change replication project for Ball State SPCE 611. The study we chose to replicate was a study involving testing the outcome of learning a new language by implementing both tact and listener responding interventions within all of the 6 members of the group. This was a great study to choose based off of our location. We're all kind of in separate parts of the Midwest. And this was a study that we could really get into and all of us had an interest in. The language we decided to learn was Portuguese. The reason Portuguese stood out to the group, it was the native language of the children in the original study, and none of us had prior experience with Portuguese. The original study had 2 interventions to test, the tact and listener responding. During the tact intervention, the participants were shown various pictures of fruit, and they were asked to identify the fruit using the corresponding name in Portuguese. The listener responding intervention consisted of the participants being shown an array of pictures of animals, and then they were asked to select the correct animal by its Portuguese name. The mastery criteria within the study was to obtain a score of 100% for 3 consecutive sessions. And when we met mastery criteria, we then again conducted the intraverbal post-test.
The studies were selected on the wealth of research done in 2 different sets of training. The effectiveness of tact and listener instructions on language learning. Both tact and listener are 2 behavior techniques involved in the language instructions. Each behavior is subjected in a different way per the scholars.
So the literature that we reviewed for our study, the first being evaluation of the efficiency of listener and tact instruction for children with autism. The second, tact training versus bidirectional intraverbal training in teaching a foreign language. The third, the induction of naming in children with no prior tact responses as a function of multiple exemplar histories of instruction. The fourth, the effects of tact and listener training on the emergence of bidirectional intraverbal relations. And finally, examining the utility of the stimulus pairing observation procedure with preschool children learning a second language.
Duff and et al. Sought out to identify the tact and listener instruction efficiency among children. The study demonstrated that the bond between the listener and the speaker is very important to learners. The main objective of the study was to determine and compare the effects of the listener relations for children with autism. Thus, the goal was to evaluate whether an instructor could effectively emphasize the speaker in listener programs. As you can see in their study, the tact instruction was more effective than the listener instruction for all of their participants. For Donovan, the study focuses on 3 repertoires: foreign language tact, native to foreign intraverbal, and foreign to native intraverbal. He identifies the effects of combining tact and listener training of exemplar names and categories. The study demonstrates that the naming repertoire is made up of bidirectional relations between the speaker behavior and the listener, the frame between the word, coordination, and reference. And as you can see in his study, tact training was more efficient than bidirectional interverbal training. As far as Fiorelli and Greer, they conducted a study which illustrated that the naming of infants was no prior track response and function of multiple exemplar histories of instructions. And in their study, they actually thought that there need to be more research done as far as teaching foreign language to kids with language delays. In other studies, such as Couture et al., they evaluated the effects of TAT and listener training on the emergence of bidirectional and interverbal relations. These two variables were indecent variables. The dependent variable was the interverbal relations tested through instructioning the cohort either by vocalization of both foreign and native language or by the use of visual stimuli. And in their study, it was determined that TAT and listener produced an increase in learning a foreign language. In Roselli et al., they explored the effectiveness of stimulus pairing observation procedures in facilitating TAT and listener relations for preschoolers learning a second language. They actually noted that the listener relations was more than the TAT in establishing simple vocabulary skills.
Next, we have our methods section. For our participants, we had the 6 of us. Our ages ranged from 24 to 48, and that differs from the original study because they were all children. And we are all located in the United States, and the children in the original study were located in Brazil. All of us are fluent, all of us were exposed to education of foreign language, but not fluent in French, Spanish, and Japanese. This is different from the participants in the original study because they had never been exposed to formal education of another foreign language before. And then we had one participant who fluently spoke several languages, and those are listed right there. And you can go to the next slide. Our settings, we did our sessions over Zoom twice per week, and they each lasted 10 to 15 minutes. We also used a website called Kahoot. This was needed because when we were doing our listener responding sessions, it was very difficult over Zoom to choose from an array. So we actually used Kahoot, and it's pictured here what the layout looked like. That way we could all select a picture online instead of trying to pick and hold various cards in our hands over Zoom. The materials we used 6 colored pictures of fruits and animals with a white background. We chose these to be similar to the original study, and also by doing an interverbal test with each participant. If at any point they got the card correct, so let's say we held up this orange card, for example, and said, what is this in Portuguese? If they answered correctly, we would not include that in our study. So we made sure no one knew what any of the words were in Portuguese. And any Portuguese words that were similar to English words were avoided. So we have examples of these cards right here. And when they were presented to participants, the name was not listed. So it was just a blank card with the picture.
So the behavior we were taking data on was correct responding during TAC trials, which was vocalization of the Portuguese word in response to what is this? What is the English version of this word, or vice versa. The picture card was presented. We had 10 seconds within our first attempt. And the collection was taken by the experimenter. And then of course, for the listener response, it was taken by Kahoot. We had an interverbal pretest, which we talked about a little bit, where no words were shown to us, no consequences were given for correct or incorrect responses. It was just, what is this? Go on. Baseline was pretty similar. We had the experimenter present fruits one at a time for the tacting section. And the experimenter would ask, what is this in Portuguese? Again, we had 10 seconds within our first attempt, and then it was scored from there. And then for the listener responding, same thing, except it was animals this time, and it was in Kahoot. So we shared the screen with the experimenter.
They were listed across our screen from left to right. And then on our phone, we would click in the corresponding shape to what we thought was the correct one. And no consequences were provided after correct or incorrect responses. And for the intervention, the procedure was exactly the same. Experimenter showing cards for the tacting, and then the Kahoot for the listener response. Only this time social consequences were added, such as well done or good job, you got it. If it was wrong or we just didn't have an answer, the experimenter would give the answer just one time per trial. And also the cards were rotated and displayed in random order each and every time for each participant for each trial. Mastery criterion was 100% correct responses in 3 consecutive 6 trial blocks. And after that, we would have the intraverbal post test. So if they didn't hit the mastery criterion, they didn't have the intraverbal post test. It was the same procedure as the pre-test, exactly the same. The only difference was social consequences were still given for correct or incorrect responses this time.
So to collect the IOA data, what we did was we were the group of 6 members. So in order to collect IOA data, we divided our groups into 2 groups with 3 members on each. And in each group, we assigned 1 experimenter, 1 inter-observer, and 1 fidelity checkers. So one group conducted trial in another group and vice versa. So we also had separate stimulus set for each group. So during the Zoom meeting, we broke out into break rooms, and each break room had experimenter, inter-observer, and the study participant. So we collected the IOA data in total of 50% of all trial blocks, and an agreement was considered when the experimenter and observer scored a correct response or when both scored an incorrect response. So IOA was collected by dividing the number of agreements divided by the number of agreements plus number of disagreements and multiplied by 100%. So the agreement for the instruction was 98.3% for Pam, 100% for Delaney, 96.6% for Mila, 100% for Krista, 100% for Caitlin, and 100% for Caitlin. So for the treatment fidelity, so we made sure all of the intervention steps were performed correctly, and we provided feedbacks whenever necessary. So we collected fidelity data also, like total of 30% of treatment fidelity checks were done for the intervention sessions and also for the interverbal test for each participants. So there were different steps. So there were like 2 tact instructions and the listener's instructions. So we made sure if all the steps were being followed or not. For instance, for the tact instructions, we checked, did the experimenter presented a picture card from set A one at a time so that the participant can see it clearly? And did the experimenter ask the subject, what is this in Portuguese? Did the experimenter give 10 seconds to respond? And after the correct response, did the experimenter provided social consequences? And if the answer was wrong or was no response within the 10 seconds, did the experimenter immediately vocalize the correct answer? Only 1 time per trial. And for every participant was the picture card presented in random order. So that was for the tact instructions. And while for the listener's instructions, we checked these 6 steps again. Only the difference here was we checked if did the experimenter shared a Zoom screen and displayed 3 picture levels with 3 different shapes from the set B horizontally on the website Kahoot. And And again, did the experimenter ask what shape belonged to Portuguese name? Did the experimenter give 10 seconds to respond? Was the social consequences provided? If their answer was incorrect or no response, did the experimenter immediately vocalize the shape that belonged to the correct answer? Only one time per trial. And lastly, where the comparison pictures rotated in every new trial. So we checked all these, and once after we calculated the treatment fidelity, we got that the treatment integrity was 100% for all the participants. Now moving on to our results section. So everybody will be discussing their own results, so one by one. So let me start with mine. So as you can see here, in the interverbal, so in the beginning, we conducted the interverbal test, and before the intervention, as you can see, I was not able to answer any I was not able to get any correct responses in both the directions, in Portuguese to English, English to Portuguese, in both the categories, fruits and animals. Then we went ahead and did our baseline section. Here you can see that in the baseline section, I was not able to get any correct answers in the tact intervention, where we use the fruits as our stimulus sets. And for the listener section, we used animals as the stimulus set. And I was able to get one correct. And that was just because I got lucky, because it was just like a multiple choice question. And I happened to choose the correct answer. And but like I had not got any training before that. So it was just out of the luck. And then we went ahead and started our intervention section. And for the intervention section, as you can see here, for the beginning, for my first training trial, I was not able to get any correct answers. And slowly, by the time I got up to the 10th trial, I was able to master the tact. And for the listeners' instructions, I have still not mastered it yet. And after I mastered the tact session and the tact instructions, I was then exposed to the interverbal test, and I was able to correctly answer all the questions in the set, the fruits in the stimulus set fruits, and I was able to answer both Portuguese to English and English to Portuguese. I was able to get all the correct answers. And for me, the tact instructions was more effective for me. And I think that was because I was able to associate the words with my native language. For instance, so in Portuguese, grapefruit means toranja. So toran means garland in my native language. So I was able to associate it, and that helped me remember those words easily. And also, like after each trial session, after the experimenter gave me the correct answer, I was repeating those answers again and again. So that helped me as well. So that way I was able to get master the tact quicker than the listener section. So yeah, that is my result. Now let's move on to the next result.
Okay, these are my results. And just like Mila, I scored very low in the interverbal test. I scored both zeros in fruits and animals, Portuguese to English and English to Portuguese. And then when we started baseline, I was very surprised. I got 4 correct responses during the listener responding section. But similar to what Mila said, I believe it was mainly luck due to multiple choice, because like Kat has said before, when we were running interverbal tests, we weeded out all the words that were similar to Spanish. So these were all new to me. But for tact, I scored low again in baseline just because, well, for one, I was never good at Spanish. So none of that has stuck. Even the pronunciations were hard for me. So then when we introduced intervention, I slowly had a increasing trend for both tact and listener responding. But for listener responding, I think the multiple choice was on my side, and I mastered that out before tact. But depending on, or by looking at my graph, I will probably master tact out maybe in the next couple of sessions here.
In my case, when TAT instruction was used on the first, on the fruit set, I was unable to identify them correctly in all 6 trials. I didn't even identify them correctly when intervention was used for 3 consecutive days. I achieved 2 correct responses on the 4th day and on the 5th day, and I gradually improved. As you can see towards the end, the effectiveness of the TAC training through various interventions really helped. And I seem to gradually improve in both towards the end, even though I didn't master in the listener responder section, but I did master in TAC.
And here are my results, just like everyone has said with the animals in baseline. I believe that luck was on my side there with the multiple choice. Once we moved into intervention, however, I did really well with the listener responding, but I think it's because I am definitely like a visual learner. Like seeing the actual word is very helpful, especially when I was learning French in high school. I could read it better than I could speak it. So you can see my tacting data here is slow in the beginning, and then we sort of have an upward trend. Pronunciation was never my friend. I can picture the word, I just cannot say it correctly. So my tacting got a little better towards the end, but I have not mastered it yet.
Okay, now we have my results. Similar to the rest of the group for the intraverbal pre-test before any exposure, I got 0s across the board for both the tacting and the listener responding interventions for both Portuguese to English and English to Portuguese. And then during the baseline stage, the baseline for the listener responding, the array of animals, again, luck was on my side. I did pretty well during the baseline. I also am a very visual learner. But however, I got 0 for the tacting, and that was a little bit more difficult for me. Although I had some previous exposure in high school to Spanish, none of the words were similar. Again, the pronunciation was kind of tricky, and it was really hard, and none of the words were similar to any of the English words either. So it was really hard to just pull a word out that you've never had exposure to before. But then once the interventions began, I did a lot better with the listener responding with the animals than I did with the tact. There were many trials where I just had 0s, but eventually with the prompting and repeating it to myself and just practicing, I eventually had an increasing trend and then dropped down a little bit, and then eventually was able to master out of it.
So in my graph, I didn't start off with 0, except in the intraverbal. I definitely had 0 in everything. In baseline, I actually got a few. I actually got 100% in the baseline listener responding, but just like everybody else said, I think it was just luck because it was multiple choice. I'm just very good at like eliminating things that I know are not the correct answer. So I actually mastered out of that one pretty quickly. So I got to go to the intraverbal post test after about after about 3 trials, I think. And at the very end in the post-test, I did get all of the fruits, but the animals, I did miss 2 in the Portuguese to English, and I did miss 1 in the English to Portuguese. And it was definitely a lot of the, at least in my case, it was a lot of the pronunciations, because a lot of our animals tended to have the letter X in it. And a lot of us were getting very confused on how to pronounce that and exactly where it went. So yeah, we did not do so well with those ones.
So as you all saw our graphs, and we have not been able to achieve the mastery in at least one of the instructions for 5 of us yet, and only one of the participants was able to achieve mastery in both instructions. For Pam, Caitlin, and I, we were able to achieve mastery in tact instructions after average of 9 trials. And after receiving mastery, all 3 of us were able to pass the interverbal test in both direction, English to Portuguese and Portuguese to English. And our average accuracy in English to Portuguese trial was 6 correct answers, and also the average accuracy in Portuguese to English trial was also 6 correct responses. Whereas for Caitlin, Delaney, Krista, and Caitlin, they were able to achieve mastery in listeners' instructions faster within an average of 4 trials, and average accuracy in English to Portuguese trials were 5.75 correct responses, and accuracy in Portuguese to English trials was 5.5 correct responses. So our study so far is consistent with the original study, showing that tact instructions reliably led to the emergence of bidirectional interverbal repertoire, whereas the listener instructions did so less reliably. And though the tact instructions had greater effect on the emergence of bidirectional interverbal responses, it required on average more trials blocks than the instruction listener's instruction. So that's all about our results. So we will be moving towards the limitations.
Okay, so the limitations of our study. So first off, 2 members of the group were the learner and the instructor. Myself and Krista played this role, and even though we used 2 different sets of cards, we both agreed that learning or that teaching the language may have given us an advantage during our own sessions. Secondly, TAC trials were run on Zoom, and listener responding was done over Kahoot. So due to the extended distance between all of us, we use Zoom for our meetings and our tacting sessions. The disadvantage of using Zoom for tacting was that it didn't have the same natural flow compared to sitting across from someone at a table. And then with listener responding, we thought we would do it over Zoom at first, but just due to the limitation of, and like Kat said, holding up the cards and someone pointing, that just seemed too difficult to do over Zoom. So we chose to do Kahoot. And we were able to set a 10-second timer, but a limitation that popped up was that knowing the timer was there might have pushed for people to guess more, and that could influence our data. Thirdly, some targets were the same in Portuguese as they are in Spanish. And as we talked about, a lot of us were introduced to Spanish, back in middle school, maybe into college. So words such as gato, which is cat, and vaca was used in the original study. So we changed those. Fourthly, we had no prior exposure to Portuguese. Even though we had exposure to Spanish, it's way different. So in the original study, the children were exposed to English in their everyday lives, watching TV, playing with games, maybe video games. So for us, this led to differences in our data between participants as well as differences from the original study. And lastly, the pronunciation of Portuguese words. So another limitation is that Krista and I struggled pronunciating the words, and this could have led to incorrect responses from our participants. So in Portuguese, XIA is actually sha, and we didn't know this till about halfway through. So that could have influenced our data as well.